Hello. The next module we're going to have a look at is lookups inside of Excel. And these are made up of different types of functions for different purposes. We've got our common lookups, which is our V and our H lookup. And then later on in the module, we'll have a look at things like the match and the index functions. But let's first take a look at what is the purpose of using these functions. So in the workbook called Lookups, in the spreadsheet called Approximate Match, you have a set of data which has got employees' job ratings, their salaries, and you need to calculate the tax rate based on that information. So you need to look up data in other tables, what we call reference tables or table arrays. Now in this particular instance, to make it easier to explain, I've included the table inside of the data over here. So as your salary increases, so does your tax rate. But please keep in mind that most of the time the reference tables that you're going to be looking up information in will potentially be maybe in the same workbook but a different worksheet, and can even be in another workbook. You would still do exactly the same calculations but by clicking in that relative sheet or book. Now the first thing is to determine what kind of lookup I need to do. Now the VLOOKUP is definitely the most common in Excel, as most data runs down or vertical, making it a lot easier for us to read. So if you look at this table over here, the data runs vertically, and so we would use a VLOOKUP to grab this information. But there are times where the data, which is the exact data as I've showed you there, actually runs horizontally. In that case, you would use an H lookup. Now before we start the lookup, you will also notice that a lookup is usually two values we try and match to get back the relevant information. And in this case, you're never going to be able to match the data exactly. So this is where we use something called an approximate match. So we start by putting in our VLOOKUP formula. Before I do that, I'm actually going to make the column nice and wide so you can see the formula more clearly. And the first thing it asks you for is the lookup value. This is the information you have that you need to go and look up. So this information will never be in your reference table, but on the existing table that you're working with. So this is my lookup value over here. Comma, the table array is the reference table that I'm going to be looking the data up. In this case, it is in this sheet, but if it was in another sheet or another workbook, you would simply click on that worksheet or workbook and select the table. Don't forget to include the column headings and everything regarding that table. So I'm going to select the entire table. Now, because we're going to be copying this formula down, it's a good idea to make this table an absolute reference. And once you've selected the entire table, how you do that is you select F4 on your keyboard. That will now fix this particular table. If you go comma, the next thing it asks you is for a column index number. In other words, in which column of that table will I find the tax rate? And you don't use the Excel column headings in this case. So in this case, the Excel column headings would be G and H. Instead, you need to count the rows as 1 or 2, or the columns. So column 1 would be the salary rates, column 2 would be the tax rates, which is what you are after. Then you push comma, then it'll ask you, do you want a true value, which is an approximate match, or a false value, which is an exact match? In this case, you would never be able to find an exact match because you are looking for a range of data. So in this case, we are going to double click true, which is an approximate match. You can then close your bracket or simply hit enter. Once you've done that, we can then copy the values down and then turn our data into a percentage style format. I'm just going to move it into the center and make my column width slightly smaller. Let's test to see how the data has worked out. Let's put this particular employee on a tax rate of 11%, which is over here. Now, if, for example, we've got a salary of, say, 84,000, You could argue that that should go to the 12% tax bracket because it's closer to that. However, the way the lookups work is that until such time as you've reached that value, you won't fall into that particular tax bracket. It'll come as close as possible and then give you the corresponding percentage. Right, now that we've created the VLOOKUP, just purely for information, in case you do need to do it, let's take a look at now doing an HLOOKUP. For the purpose of creating the HLOOKUP, I'm going to go and I'm going to delete my values of my VLOOKUP. Remember, it's exactly the same function except moving across in the opposite direction. So you would select HLOOKUP. Your lookup value would be exactly the same, comma. Your table array will be your horizontal table, and now you can see why HLOOKUPs are not very practical in terms of Excel. Don't forget F4 to lock this table. Instead of asking for a column index number, because it's an HLOOKUP, it's asking for a row number. So in which row of that table is my tax percentage, row 1 or row 2? In this case, you will find the answer in row 2. Comma, again, we are looking for an approximate match, not an exact match. And then you select Enter. It's exactly the same formula, exactly the same calculations, but just using the HLOOKUP reference.